Greetings! It's a rainy day in the Sunshine State, and we are a month ahead of the festival season coming up. The Day of Trumpeting is coming up, and then the Day of Atonement, the 7 days of the Festival of Tabernacles, and the 8th day of Sacred Assembly. This is the secular year of 2022, and if any of you have the idea of coming down here for any of those 8 days, the Festival of Tabernacles, the 8th day of Sacred Assembly, as we say, you all come on down here and enjoy Central Florida, and we'd love to have you. And if you have an interest, we have a block of rooms at a hotel in Kissimmee, Florida, set aside. We have a discount rate at that hotel, so you can let us know if you're interested in coming. We have a website, but actually we have an email address, I meant to say, which you'll see at the end of this podcast today. There was a fellow who read a whole lot of self-help books. He read a lot of self-help books, and he found the secret to financial success. He's going to write a self-help book. Hope you like that. As I'm speaking in the summer of 2022, from my perspective, as I've lived a while now, and I try to keep up with news, current events, and I do find, generally speaking, a kind of decay taking place in much of the world, a kind of decline in standards. And we have in history these ups and downs, these periods of breakdown, and then there's at times a backlash and maybe a regaining of a more solid, stable situation. But right now, unfortunately, I see a lot of turbulence around and a lot of declining standards. And at a time like that, it's very important for God's people, for people who want to have a relationship with God, who want to have a relationship with His Word, to remain firm and really become more and more familiar with God's Word and more committed to stick with it in the face of the declining standards around us, which I believe is generally the case. In Matthew 24, speaking about the time before His return, Jesus Christ prophesied in verse 12, "And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold." So don't let the decline of standards around you be an influence on you. It should cause us rather to be even more firm than ever in trying to think, say, and do what is right. And as it says in the 13th verse, "But he who endures to the end shall be saved." I want to go back to in some ways, a similar period where there was a decline of standards. After Israel entered the Promised Land, Joshua died and the elders who'd known him died, and we're in the 14th century BC, and the standards are declining. There's a breakdown, and the nation also is very disorganized. It's broken down into tribes and clans. There's no real central authority. Later on, of course, the people wanted a king, and so the central authority turned out to be a monarch. At this point, though, there really was no central authority. And in Judges 17, I'm talking about the period of the judges. Because of the sins of the people, they were often oppressed by their neighboring nations, and God occasionally would raise up a judge, a righteous leader, who would deliver his people. And one of them, by the way, who you'll find in the 3rd chapter of Judges, is Ehud. And he was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he was left-handed, and that helped him in his opportunity to deliver Israel. You can read about that in Judges 3. And that seemed to be a tendency among Benjamites to be left-handed. And, if you study culture, people who are left-handed are living in a world where generally people are right-handed, so they tend to also want to also use their right hand. So left-handed people can, I think, in a higher percentage of them become ambidextrous. And you find in reading 1 Chronicles 12 that at the time of David, there were Benjamites who were ambidextrous warriors. They could fight with either hand. You can read about them in 1 Chronicles 12. And I'll say more about Benjamin in just a moment. Unfortunately, I've said some positive things about Benjamin. I'm about to also say some negative things. But I want to go to Judges 17:6. This was the state of affairs. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. You know, it was a time of a breakdown of standards. And when that happens, it's a slippery slope. Things get worse and worse until, as I said, at times you do have a backlash and the pendulum swings the other way. But often it gets really, really bad before that happens. And that's the situation here in Judges 20. Judges 20 is about an episode which actually happened early in the period of the Judges. It's covered here at the end of the chapter. One reason is because it involves the tribe of Benjamin. And once Israel wanted a monarch, that wasn't God's first choice, but he gave them a monarch. And originally, the first monarch was Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. So perhaps one reason you have this episode written here is because it leads up to the fact that although Benjamin was, very decadent here, later on we have God deciding to choose a Benjamite as the first king of Israel. I'm going to say more about that subject. I'm going to say more about what happened to Benjamin later on. Saul, unfortunately, didn't pan out as king, and ultimately, of course, David became king, and then the Davidic line continued, and of course, Jesus Christ ultimately will come from the Davidic line. The Messiah, the Christ, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, will come from that Davidic line. But I was going to go back and talk about why it is that perhaps God chose Benjamin to have the first shot at the monarchy. Jacob loved Rachel. He did wind up having to marry Leah first, and he even and then his wives encouraged him to take concubines to have more children. But his first love was Rachel, and the firstborn of Rachel, Joseph, was the birthright tribe, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh was older, but Ephraim was dominant. So Joseph had a double portion. It was the birthright tribe. And Benjamin, as the second-born of Rachel, also is given a certain standing. And as I said, the first monarch over the whole nation was from Benjamin. But here, unfortunately, Benjamin had sunk to a very low level in this period of the Judges, early in that time. And so we go to Judges 19. And again, it starts out by talking about the condition of the country at that time. And it came to pass in those days when there was no king in Israel, that there was a certain Levite staying in the remote mountains of Ephraim. He took for himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. But his concubine played the harlot against him and went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah and was there for 4 whole months. Then her husband arose and went after her. You see already it's a rather sordid arrangement from the start here. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back, having a servant and a couple of donkeys with him. So she brought him into her father's house, and when the father of the young woman saw him, he was glad to meet him. And his father-in-law, the young woman's father, detained him, and he stayed with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and lodged there. But it went on and on. This host kept dragging him to stay longer and longer. And finally, when he had to leave, he wound up leaving later than he wanted to. You could read the passage, but I'm going to pick it up where he finally does leave, but he's leaving later than he wants to leave. So I'm in verse 9. And when the man stood to depart, he and his concubine and his servant, his father-in-law, the young woman's father, said to him, look, the day is now drawing toward evening. Please spend the night. So he's still trying to keep him. See, the day is coming to an end. Lodge here, that your heart may be merry. Tomorrow go your way early, so that you may get home. However, the man was not willing to spend that night. He'd had enough. I want to get going. But it was not the wisest thing to travel at night. However, the man was not willing to spend that night, so he rose and departed and came opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. But at that time, Jebus was populated by Canaanites. With him were the 2 saddled donkeys. The concubine was also with him. As they were near Jebus, and the day was far spent, and the servant said to his master, "Come, please, let us turn aside into the city of the Jebusites and lodge in it." But his master said to him, "We will not turn aside here into a city of foreigners, who are not of the children of Israel. We will go on to Gibeah." So he felt awkward staying with Canaanites. He wanted to stay with his own kind. So he said to his servant, "Come, let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or in Ramah." And they passed by and went their way, and the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. Now I'm in verse 15 of Judges 20, if you're reading, Judges 19, if you're reading along with me. They turned aside there to go in to lodge in Gibeah, and when he went in, he sat down in the open square of the city, for no one would take them into his house to spend the night. Isn't that something? He went to his own kind, and now he's out in the street. Just then an old man came in from his work in the field at evening, who also was from the mountains of Ephraim. He was staying in Gibeah, whereas the men of the place were Benjamites. And when he raised his eyes and he saw the traveler in the open square of the city, and the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" And so he answered, in verse 19, I'm going to jump into there. "Although we have both straw and fodder for our donkeys, and bread and wine for myself, for your female servant, and for the young man who is with your servant, there is no lack of anything." So he just wants a place to stay. He can take care of himself. And the old man said in verse 20, "Peace be with you. However, let all your needs be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the open square." So this is a tradition in the Middle East, of hospitality. Unfortunately, the locals didn't have it, but he did. So he brought him into his house and gave fodder to the donkeys, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. Now in verse 22, "And as they were enjoying themselves, suddenly certain men of the city, perverted men, surrounded the house and beat on the door. They spoke to the master of the house, the old man, saying, 'Bring out the man who came to our house, that we may know him carnally.'" That's the idea. It's in italics, but that's the idea. "But the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, 'No, my brethren, I beg you do not act so wickedly. Seeing this man has come into my house, do not commit this outrage.'" Remember Sodom and Gomorrah? This incident is not as well known, of course, but it goes back, it's here we go again, Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Part 2, or 201, I guess we would say, huh? "Look, here is my virgin daughter." Now here again, reminds one of Lot, even though he's called righteous Lot. But here again, hospitality is so important. Don't molest the man. Take my daughter. "Look, here is my virgin daughter and the man's concubine. Let me bring them out now." Well, evidently he was taking care of the man, but the concubine had a lower status. He was even willing to let her go out there. "Humble them and do with them as you please, but to this man do not do such a vile thing." So that was his the way he approached it. And of course there are various moral issues here: homosexuality, rape. Both of those issues are there, among others. Those are obviously very serious offenses in the Bible. You look at, for example, Leviticus 18. "But the men would not heed him. So the man took his concubine and brought her out to them." And, so evidently the daughter of the master was not involved, but the man did give them his concubine, and they knew her and abused her all night until morning, and when the day began to break, they let her go. Then the woman came as the day was dawning, and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, till it was light. She had really been abused, I read it to you. When her master arose in the morning and opened the doors of the house and went out to go his way, there was his concubine fallen at the door of the house with her hands on the threshold. So he waited till morning to even check on what was going on. Well, of course, he feared for his life and so forth, and for what would happen to him and the servant and maybe the owner of the home and so on, or the person whose home he was staying at that time. And he said to her, "Get up and let us be going." But there was no answer. So the man lifted her onto the donkey, and the man got up and went to his place. She had died finally. Finally she died. So this is now how he dealt with the situation. When he entered his house, he took a knife, laid hold of his concubine, and divided her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And so it was that all who saw it said, "No such deed has been done or seen from the day that the children of Israel came up from the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, confer, and speak up." So this was such an outrage that when he sent the parts of her body to the various tribes, they decided they must gather together and deal with this matter. Those who had performed this deed needed to be brought to justice. And they were from that Benjamite city of Gibeah. So in verse 20, we find a gathering of all of the various tribes. So all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, as well as from the land of Gilead, even from across the Jordan. And the congregation gathered together as one man before the Lord at Mizpah. So they wanted to pray and to have God involved in this. And the leaders of all the people, all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly of the people of God, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. Now the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. Then the children of Israel said, "Tell us, how did this wicked deed happen?" So the Levite, the husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, told the story. And verse 7, "Look, all of you children of Israel, give your advice and counsel here and now." So the people arose as one man, saying, "None of us will go to his tent nor will any turn back to his house. But now this is the thing which we will do to Gibeah. We will go up against it by lot." They decided they were going to punish this city for what had happened. "We will take 10 men out of every 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, 100 out of every 1,000, 1,000 out of every 10,000, to make provisions for the people, that when they come to Gibeah and Benjamin, they may repay all the vileness that they have done in Israel." So all the men of Israel were gathered against the city, united together as one man. Then all the tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, "What is this wickedness that has occurred among you? Now therefore deliver up the men, the perverted men who are in Gibeah, that we may put them to death and remove the evil from Israel." But the children of Benjamin would not listen to the voice of their brethren, the children of Israel. They wouldn't give over the perpetrators to be executed. Rather, they decided to go to war. So now we have a civil war in the country, Benjamin against the rest of the country. Instead, the children of Benjamin gathered together from their cities to Gibeah to go to battle against the children of Israel. And it mentions figures here and so on. And I think it also mentions, in verse 16, the left-handedness evidently is a feature to be, something out of the ordinary. So it's mentioned again about Benjamin. Among all this people, where there were 700 select men who were left-handed, everyone could sling a stone at a hair's breadth and not miss. The Benjamites were great warriors, and they felt that even though they were outnumbered, they could defeat the other tribes. And so the children of Israel prayed about it, and God directed them, that Judah should lead them, which makes sense. But God allowed them to be defeated a couple of times. So what was going on here? Perhaps, although they were very indignant about what had happened, they themselves, perhaps in many other ways, were sinning as well. So God did not allow them to have the victory the first couple of times out. He sent them out, and at the same time, they failed. Or you could say he sent them out and then allowed them to either win or lose. And the first 2 times they lost. The third time he was perhaps more involved. And the third time they won. But in the meantime, a couple of times they lost 40,000 people, as you'll see here. But then the third time, now we have Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, involved. So you see, this is early in the days of the judges. Earlier in the book of Judges, you read about how a grandson of Moses was involved in corruption. But here the grandson of Aaron is still maintaining the standards. And let's go to where he comes out, Phinehas. The third time when Phinehas comes out, verse 28. And they even brought the Ark of the Covenant into that area. They really wanted to be careful to involve God in it, and they even brought the Ark over there, the Ark of the Covenant. In verse 28, and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, stood before it in those days, saying, Shall I yet go again go out to battle against the children of my brother Benjamin, or shall I cease? And the Lord said, Go up, for tomorrow I will deliver them into your hand. So the third time, God prophesied, you're going to win. And indeed they did. And you can read their strategy here. You might want to, I would hope at some point in your life you'll go through this passage. It's Holy Writ. And you'll see that Benjamin was decisively defeated. And I'm going down to verse 30. So the children of Benjamin saw that they were defeated. The men of Israel had given ground to the Benjamites because, let me see, I'm sorry. I'm there. The men of Israel had given ground to the Benjamites because they relied on the men in ambush whom they had set against Gibeah. And I'm not going to read about the whole battle, the strategy. You could, as I said, it's something you could read. But what I wanted to mention is that so many Benjamites were killed that there wound up being only 600 of them left. 600 men who could in effect beget children. Adult males who could beget children. In verse 45, let's go even further. Verse 47. But 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness by the rock of Rimmon, and they stayed at the rock of Rimmon for 4 months. They hid out there. They were the last of the tribe. This is because Israel went way overboard. They destroyed everybody else in Benjamin. The children, the women, they destroyed everything, everybody but those 600 men. Talk about an overreaction. And the men of Israel turned back against the children of Benjamin and struck them down with the edge of the sword from every city, men and beasts, all who were found. They also set fire to all the cities they came to. And then they come to the realization, all that's left of Benjamin are 600 men. God intended there be 12 tribes of Israel. Well, what are we going to do? Now, they had made a vow that none of their daughters could marry a Benjamite. And so now the 600 Benjamite men had no women of their own, and the Israelites had vowed that none of their sons could marry a Benjamite. So they're in quite a situation. And obviously you wonder about the wisdom of a lot of these things, but that's what I'm telling you. There was a breakdown of standards, and as I said, it leads to a slippery slope, and it leads to reaction and overreaction, overcompensation for the problem at times. You go from being really lax to really strict, Anyway, I'm in chapter 21. Now the children of Israel had sworn an oath at Mizpah. Well, I'll skip that. I talked about the oath. They prayed about it, and then finally, in verse 5, of course they offered sacrifices, and then in verse 5, then the children of Israel said, who was there among all the tribes of Israel who did not come up with the assembly of the Lord? For they had made a great oath concerning anyone who had not come up to the Lord at Mizpah, saying, he shall surely be put to death. So they actually said, if you're not going to volunteer, contribute to this, contribute to this lottery of those who would punish the Gibeonites, the Benjamites, then we'll kill you. Again, well, anyway, that again would seem extreme behavior, to say the least. And the children of Israel grieved for Benjamin, their brother, and said, one tribe is cut off from Israel today. A fine time to grieve now. What shall we do for wives for those who remain, saying, we have sworn by the Lord that we will not give them our daughters as wives. So here's the solution, if you want to call it that. And they said, what one is there from the tribes of Israel who did not come up to Mizpah to the Lord? And in fact, no one had come from the camp to the camp from Jabesh Gilead to the assembly. As far as I understand, this was the eastern half tribe of Manasseh, and so they were closely related to Benjamin. As I said, Benjamin was a child of Rachel. Manasseh was from Joseph. And Joseph was the firstborn of Rachel. So these were the closest relatives to Benjamin. And interestingly, they had not participated. So in verse 9, and when the people were counted, indeed, not one of the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead were there. For whatever reason, they stayed out of it. So the congregation sent out their 12,000 of their most valiant men and commanded them, saying, go and strike the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead with the edge of the sword, including the women and children. And this is the thing that you shall do. You shall utterly destroy every male and every woman who has not known a man intimately. So they found among the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead 400 young virgins who had not known a man intimately, and they brought them to the camp in Shiloh, which is in the land of Canaan. So now we've got 400 women for the Benjamite men. Then the whole congregation sent word to the children of Benjamin who were on the rock of Rimmon and announced peace to them. Okay, so peace now between Benjamin and the other tribes. That's step one. Step two, you can have these 400 virgins. So Benjamin came back at that time, and they gave them the women whom they had stayed alive of the women of Jabesh Gilead, and yet they had not found enough for them. There's 200 men that still don't have wives. And the big people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a void in the tribes of Israel. Well, God had told him to go ahead and battle with Benjamin, because Benjamin had decided, instead of punishing those people, that they would go to war to protect them. So yes, Israel was justified in going to war with Benjamin. But what about all these other extreme actions, wiping out almost the entire tribe and so on? So why God is not to be blamed for a lot of these decisions that they made, but that was their attitude. Obviously, God would not be pleased with the wiping out of a tribe. So anyway, I was back in verse 15, and the people grieved for Benjamin because the Lord had made a void in the tribes of Israel. It's really their fault. Then the elders of the congregation said, what shall we do for wives for those who remain, since the women of Benjamin have been destroyed? And they said, there must be an inheritance for the survivors of Benjamin, that a tribe may not be destroyed from Israel. However, we cannot give them wives from our daughters, for the children of Israel have sworn an oath, saying, cursed be the one who gives a wife to Benjamin. Then they said, in fact, there is a yearly feast of the Lord in Shiloh, and so I believe that they're in Shiloh when they're saying this, but they're being more specific about the location of the feast and why it's going to work out conveniently. Then they said, in fact, there is a yearly feast of the Lord in Shiloh, which is north of Bethel, on the east side of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebonah. So around the city of Shechem, which is modern Nablus, it talks about that area. You're heading towards that area. It's not where it is. It's in Shiloh. But, they mention that it's north of Bethel, Shiloh is north of Bethel, but on the east side of the highway that goes up from Bethel to Shechem and south of Lebonah. Therefore, they instructed the children of Benjamin, saying, "Go lie in wait in the vineyards." Now, this was very likely around this time of year, this is the 30th of the 5th month, so about 2 weeks ago. This was probably the 15th day of the 5th month, Tu B'Av in Hebrew, Chamisha Asar B'Av, and it's the time of the wine harvest. And it was a time in ancient Israel when the eligible maidens would dance in front of the males. And so today in modern Israel, Tu B'Av is a time of engagements, a time of marriages in modern Israel today. So maybe that's what the occasion was. The Bible isn't specific, but that's a traditional understanding of it. But obviously, this is not the intent of what happened here. If you ever saw the movie Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, I suppose that's partly based on this. It's also based on an account in the history of ancient Rome that I won't go into. Verse 20, therefore they instructed the children of Benjamin, saying, "Go lie in..." It's also, I think, about that parable of the seven brothers in the Gospels too. But enough of Hollywood. Back to the Bible. Therefore they instructed the children of Benjamin, saying, "Go lie in wait in the vineyards, and watch, and just when the daughters of Shiloh come out to perform their dances, then come out from the vineyards, and every man catch a wife for himself from the daughters of Shiloh, then go to the land of Benjamin. Then it shall be, when their fathers or their brothers come to us to complain, that we will say to them, Be kind to them for our sakes, because we did not take a wife for any of them in the war. For it is not as though you have given the women to them at this time, making yourselves guilty of your oath." You didn't violate the oath; they took the women. So therefore, you're not culpable for your oath. But now they have enough wives for this. Each of the 600 men now has a wife. And the children of Benjamin did so. They took enough wives for their number from those who danced, whom they caught. Then they went and returned to their inheritance, and they rebuilt the cities and dwelt in them. So the children of Israel departed from there at that time, every man to his tribe and family. They went out from there, every man to his inheritance. But this story, I only covered it in part, but obviously it's not a pleasant thing to talk about. It's there in the scripture, and it shows us what happens in a society as standards break down. As I said, you have in a way a slippery slope, and you have sometimes overzealousness, in a wrong direction, and overcorrection for the problem, that you had before. But there it is in the scripture. Now, the good news is that later on in the time of the judges, various judges, of course, did arise, as I said earlier. But finally, when you come to the end of the period, you had the prophet Samuel. He was a prophet and a judge, and he helped to bring the children of Israel together. And he played a major role in a kind of a spiritual revival later on. But notice the summary of how these things happen, why this account is in the Bible. In verse 25, the end of the book of Judges, how it ends. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So and the result is what you see here. Now, the good news is, besides what I've already told you, is that the tribe of Benjamin did recoup and did flourish. And from Benjamin, we have Mordecai. The hero, of course, the heroine of the story is his cousin Esther. But nevertheless, Mordecai is very critically important to the account, and he's from the tribe of Benjamin. And then, later on, we have another Saul. This is Saul of Tarsus, the Apostle Paul. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. So we do have, some positive things to say later on, coming from the tribe of Benjamin. So, of course, thank God Benjamin, as God intended, did survive this very hideous episode and did rebuild and recoup. And became, again, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. But the account is here, in effect, to warn us. We do need to maintain proper standards, and even if things around us are not going the way they should, we must, as best we can, maintain the proper standards. because ultimately, God is the winner, and if we maintain proper standards, we're the winners. And so the lesson of this is in 1 Corinthians, the 15th chapter. And so I go there now. 1 Corinthians 15, it talks about the fact that if we are on God's side, we're the winners. In 1 Corinthians 15:57, but thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. My message then is therefore, verse 58, therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. All the best to you and yours.